Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Epic Comic Book Wednesday. This is a world's finest collaboration between myself and Michael K Vaughan, where we combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about the comics on which we've wasted our youths. and today's pick, of course, Mike does the picking. I don't, because I horned my way into an innocent little event of his, so it seemed only the right thing to do, to give him the steering wheel. And today's comic is a comic book adaptation of a book that, to put it mildly, is a point of commonality between Michael K Vaughan and myself. A lot of you watching Epic Comic Book Wednesday are secretly waiting for us to disagree. And you might think that because of today's choice of subject matter, today will not be one of those videos. But the subject matter is Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. Michael K Vaughan has read Dracula more times than he can count. And I have read Dracula more times than I can count. We both have a bottomless love for the book. So you'd think that would put us in smooth sailing territory for the comic that Mike chose today, which is an ill-fated and uneven literal adaptation of Dracula done by Roy Thomas, who I consider to be the greatest comic book writer of all time. He's a huge fan of Dracula. He's also a huge fan of literary adaptations. And for an old Dracula magazine, Dracula Lives, I'm sure that Michael K Vaughan is the only person who has copies of this thing. He started an adaptation of Dracula. Him doing the scripting, basically just figuring out exactly how to use Stoker's own words. And the artwork being done by Dick Giordano, who's far more known as an inker than an artist. And they wanted to do it slowly, even chapter by chapter, and the sales for Dracula Lives were never going to support that. The sales for any other horror comics were never going to support that, because horror comics are lame. And so the thing languished. It was unfinished, and it languished, and then, I don't know, the minutes of the old-timey club were read out, and it was voted on over flagons of ale that these two 140-year-olds should be exhumed and made to finish the work they started, to finish their adaptation of Dracula. I'm not actually sure what the rationale was or what kind of back-end recouping of cost the company could possibly have thought they would get out of this. Unless it's just that the adaptation was commissioned and finished, I think, by Marvel Comics. It might have been that they did that because at the time they did that, they were trying to launch a new realization of Dracula. Dracula is kind of a horror superhero with a long white ponytail. I think the timing is about the same for that. And typically speaking, when you're dealing with a soulless corporation like Marvel Comics, that's all you need is some bean counter in the home office with reflective sunglasses to say, hey, don't we own Dracula? Can't we get him in the comics? And, you know, we got any other Dracula stuff hanging around? And so Roy Thomas and Dick Giordano finished their adaptation of Dracula. And that's what we're talking about today. This is the cover to this adaptation. I think those are supposed to be eyes. I think that's supposed to be a crown. I think that's supposed to be a woman. I think this is supposed to be effective. It is not. And unfortunately, neither is the rest of this thing. It stinks. And it doesn't stink on its own merits, if that isn't weird to say. It stinks for the reason that so-called Classics Illustrated always stink. Marvel did a long run of Classics Illustrated stories. DC Comics did a long run of them. Every other comic company in the world has done them. And the reason that they stink is because typically you've got the storyline. All you need is to find somebody who can adapt it to the page, and then an absolutely fourth-rate artist will do just fine. You do not need to be paying top-line dollar amounts for an adaptation of The Last of the Mohicans. You don't need to do that. And as a result, Classics Illustrated, which is essentially what this is an unbelievably faithful comic book adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel. The result is that Comics Illustrated issues are lifeless things. They're no pun intended for Dracula. They're boring. that problem is exacerbated when it comes to any adaptation of Dracula, because, and you won't hear me say this often, so scoot close to the radio, uh, there's never been a cinematic adaptation of Dracula that's come anywhere close to the power of the original book. I always champion on this channel that movie or film or cable adaptations of works of literature are almost always better than the works of literature they come from, but not Dracula. And the reason for that is because Bram Stoker infuses the book with a kind of very gradual, creepy, theatrical fog machine. You don't notice that it's surrounding you until you're well into the book, and Stoker knows exactly what he's doing. In this book alone, of all the other things he wrote, all the other fiction that he wrote is terrible. Okay, so we can have a few less dude bros say going on and on about the Lair of the White Worm or a Jewel or whatever. Dracula is the only effective fiction that he ever wrote, and it's really effective because he leaned into the artifices of fiction, of words on the page, of creating a mood in the mind of the reader. It absolutely doesn't work if you try to do it in some other medium, because once you translate it to another medium, you realize how little really happens, how little of what's happening we actually see. It's all shadows and innuendo. Almost all of it is the creep of losing people, of people being suborned around the edges of your social circle, or of the world in general. I might not be doing a good job of describing it, even though I've read the thing a million times and read it out loud on this channel. I haven't talked about it. I've gone through it many, many times. The book is singularly effective in a way that no comic book adaptation would ever be able to do and still be faithful. Because in order for a comic book adaptation of a work of literature to work, to really be good, it has to be two things. It has to be brilliantly illustrated, because this is a visual medium. There's no use in talking about how faithful Roy Thomas stays to the original book. It has to be brilliantly illustrated, and it has to be unfaithful. And the best possible combination of those two things are when they're being done by the same person. when you hand these things, an adaptation of a work of literature over to a genius who is doing the writing and the drawing, and is perfectly content not to be faithful. I have only known comic adaptations of classic stories to stay faithful to the original and also be effective twice. Only 2 times. One of them was for Marvel Comics' actual Classics Illustrated run. The comic book artist Bill Sienkiewicz did Moby Dick. And it's weird and sublime and is actually tremendously effective. The yardstick being that when you finish with a Classics Illustrated version of some work of literature, you should understand why it is a classic. And when you finish the Sienkiewicz Moby Dick, you know. You know why it is a classic. You are under its spell. If you haven't read Moby Dick before you read that comic book, you will certainly read it afterwards, probably immediately afterwards. And the other example that I can come up with is P. Craig Russell, the great artist P. Craig Russell, adapted Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Books. And that also is wonderful. In both cases, there's virtually nothing on the page that is not in the original. And yet, visually speaking, they're so arresting that it works. They work as adaptations. Probably not a coincidence that artists tend to do that better than writers do. Nothing like that happens in this adaptation. Nothing at all. This is a sample page of Dick Giordano's artwork. There's a bit of moodiness, just a bit. But look at all the mistakes that are being made on this page alone. Look at all the mistakes that are being made here. Look at that. The climactic panel is the middle one, where Dracula's inanimate, his inert face is struck by a shovel. That's the motion that Dick Giordano gives. Does that look dramatic to you? It looks like he accidentally bumps Dracula with a shovel. So yes, you have the good, the moodiness of the face there, but it's totally destroyed by that middle panel, which is supposed to be the whole point here of this page. And look at the way the character sits and then runs. It's all completely static, which was a complaint of mine about Dick Giordano even when he was an inker. He tends to take all the motion out of whatever he inks. It was a trial, actually. watching him for years and years and years ink Batman, much to this effect. That happens all throughout this adaptation. All throughout this adaptation, you get on the page a pretty good visual representation of what Bram Stoker's words are actually saying. You don't get any of the drama. You certainly don't get any of the atmosphere. Dick Giordano is not capable of doing that. He's not capable of doing that. And in a comic book adaptation, the artist has to be capable, or it won't work. Perfect case in point here. Perfect little proof of. I'm sure that Mike loves this thing. I'm sure that he does. I have a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because this is not the only time that Roy Thomas adapted Bram Stoker's Dracula. He did it at least 2 other times that I can think of, and one of those times was known for its inaccuracy. It was known for that, but he teams up with a great artist, and that's this. That's his adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula that was made by Francis Ford Coppola and his director of photography immediately after imbibing an entire slopping paint bucket full of mescaline. And as a result, there's very little in here that is faithful to Bram Stoker's Dracula, and yet you have Mike Mignola's artwork all throughout here. And it's incredible. And the raw bones of the story are relatively the same. They are, let me get you an example of what I'm talking about here. This is Jonathan Harker and the 3 Wives of Dracula. That is beautiful. Absolutely beautifully done. Look at that. He lets this panel just sit on its own, just quiet. Granted, Dracula doesn't look the way he should, but what difference does it make if you've got visuals this powerful? And they run all throughout here. This was done as a 4-part comic book adaptation of the Coppola movie, which had fans of Dracula howling with all the liberties that it took. And I was one of them, of course, but only because I would howl about the liberties that any movie would take with this thing, because I think it's a lost cause. And this is a perfect case in point. This comic book adaptation of Dracula is boring. Now, the real question here is for me to wonder, could a comic book adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula that is as visually arresting as the Bill Sienkiewicz Moby Dick or the P. Craig Russell Jungle Books be also accurate to Bram Stoker's book? In order to have that kind of a thing, not this, of course, this is fun, but it's a Fantasia built on Dracula. In order to have the kind of adaptation that I'm thinking of, you would have to have an artist who could do that. Everything comes down to the artist here. If the artist can't simulate that gradual, miasmic, theatrical fog, that creeping horror, if the artist can't do that, then the adaptation is going to fail. No matter who does the writing. The writing can be as faithful as you want. I think in this particular instance, Roy Thomas might be a bad choice because he has an instinct to be completist. And you can't do that in a literary adaptation. It just won't work. You have to snip and cut. It is a different medium. You have to adapt it to that medium. And I actually think there is a way that this could be done. I don't think it would be Roy Thomas. In fact, going back to Dracula Lives was kind of a satellite publication to Tomb of Dracula, a comic book series, a 4-color comic book series, written by Marv Wolfman and drawn by Gene Colan, giving you the adventures of Dracula. And the Tomb of Dracula is hilarious. It's wonderful, wonderful reading. And I would argue that Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan, with Tom Palmer inking him at the height of his power, maybe Glynis Wein doing the colors, could have produced the kind of adaptation that this thing means to be and is not. Gene Colan at the height of his powers could have done that, I think. I don't think I would have told Roy Thomas to do it. I would have got some other writer to do it. Some writer who maybe wasn't holding the original in such esteem. But anyway, there you go. That is our comic for this epic Comic Book Wednesday. It's this weird niche publication of Roy Thomas's line-by-line snoozer of an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which you should all read. So I want to end on an amicable note, because the whole reason why Mike picked this thing is a commonality between us as readers that couldn't be any greater. We both absolutely love Dracula. It's just, this is a little too niche for me. So we'll see if we have better luck next week. I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.